Right. I'm going to say a few things about artificial intelligence, but I imagine that you've heard the term, because anybody who reads newspapers or magazines these days has heard the term artificial intelligence. It inspires awe in the high-tech business community and concern and puzzlement most other places. Discussions on such things as the limits of machine intelligence have now given way to a concern for the social and economic significance of the new technology. I'm one of those people, I must tell you in advance, who is much impressed and awed by the potential of the field, and I've devoted a fair amount of time to persuading people that it's a positive force. And I've done so largely on the grounds of its economic benefits and its potential for making the fruits of computer technology available to the public. For example, to help the overworked physician, to search for oil and minerals and help manage our valuable resources, to explore, mine, and experiment in dangerous environments, to allow the non-computational public access to vast libraries of important information and even advice, and in the process to give real meaning to the Freedom of Information Act, for example. And last but not least, to entertain people, for if we don't blow ourselves off this planet, surely entertainment in its most general sense, including education, as I believe it should, is sure to be a major industry of the future. But these are fruits of the technology that many of you are probably familiar with, at least in a general way. And you're probably also aware of the many pitfalls that stand between us and their realization, including the military misuse of such work. But tonight I'd like to concentrate on another aspect of the new technology, and to some extent technology in general, that has received much less press. I want to concentrate on the intellectual significance of recent developments in computer science, and particularly in artificial intelligence. And here by intellectual significance, I mean changes in worldview that the technology brings with it. And in this case in particular, the changes in one's view of human nature. The role of technology in shaping a worldview hasn't always been adequately recognized. The process of understanding and articulating one's tenuous grasp on an evolving picture of the world is not unlike the process of creating a work of art, like a sculpture. There's at least three major elements that enter into this: the imagination and the curiosity of a creator, the nature of the tools he has available, and the resistance offered by the materials. So, for example, a sharp knife on soft wood gives you a very different product from a massive chisel on granite rock, and quite independently of the intention of the sculptor. And it's the same way with science. A brilliant man tackling the world's mysteries with only his eyes, ears, and the concepts that his native tongue makes available to him will have very different experiences and carve them up differently than will a person with the tools of a technological culture, even though the world might in some sense be the same world. So technology, by which I mean to include not only artifacts, but also this thing called technique, the complex of codified system of methods used to achieve ends, provides two things. It provides the instrumental tools that help us make observations and calculations, but it also provides conceptual tools that help us to see things in new ways. Such conceptual tools, I think, it's fair to think of such conceptual tools as being imagination prosthetics, because they typically extend the range of the conceivable. Conceptual tools have always dominated periods of intellectual progress. And I have some quotes here. Speaking of the importance of one such set of concepts, namely those provided by pure mathematics, the physicist Freeman Dyson has the following quote, which you will see if I can just press the right buttons. He says, "One factor that has remained constant through all the twists and turns of the history of physical science is the decisive importance of mathematical imagination. For a physicist, mathematics is not just the tool by means of which phenomena may be calculated, it's the main source of concepts and principles by means of which new theories can be created. Similarly, speaking of the development of new philosophical views, Susan Langer puts it this way. In every age, philosophical thinking exploits some dominant concepts and makes its greatest headway in solving problems conceived in terms of them. I won't read you the rest of that quote, but I believe that history will record that around the middle of the 20th century, many classical problems of philosophy and psychology were transformed by a new notion of process, that of a symbolic or computational process. The foundations of this idea were laid about half a century ago by mathematicians, some of them working together, some of them independently. People like Alan Turing, Alonzo Church, Kurt Gödel, Stephen Klein, and the Russian named Markov. It's really a remarkable convergence. I mean, it illustrates this idea of parallel discovery. They laid the foundations for the idea of computation about 20 years at least before computers became available. And I'll say a little bit about this later on because there were some important insights that came from these foundational ideas. But it wasn't until later in the 1950s the availability of digital computers made it possible to begin the transformation that we see today in both artificial intelligence and the closely related field of study called cognitive science, which a term that we generally use to refer to the scientific study of the processes that underlie knowing, reasoning, imagining, planning, remembering, perceiving, and things of that sort. I should remark here parenthetically that although we sometimes talk as if we know what this domain is of cognition, in fact, the domains, the boundaries of the field of study are one of the things that one discovers as the field evolves. And it's very important. There are a lot of things I might, later on in the question period, remark on it. There are a lot of things that we consider to be cognition, that we consider to be processes of reasoning that may well turn out to have nothing to do with it. And on the contrary, there are a lot of processes that seem to us to be instantaneous and intuitive that in fact involve a great deal of cognition, reasoning. I'll try to clarify what the distinction is as I go along. Now, the computer is, in a sense, it's a logical continuation of the path of technological development that's been going on ever since Homo sapiens began to make tools. Yet, in some ways, it's also a radical departure from this path. And one of the things I'd like to explore in this talk is the parallel between earlier technological trends and the development of computers, and at the same time to examine what's special about computer. Because this latter discussion is going to lead me to consider what computing has in common with human thought that recommends it as a vehicle both for the understanding and for the exercise of intelligence. And in doing that, the following is the plan. I'm going to consider three characteristics of this new technology, devoting not so much time to the first two, mostly to the third. First, I'm going to talk about the capacity that computer technology has for increasing the quantity and the quality of complexity. Secondly, its capacity to exhibit very nearly unbounded plasticity or variability in behavior. And thirdly, its capacity to determine actions on the basis of knowledge of the external world and certain goals that relate to this knowledge. So, quality and quantity of complexity, plasticity, and knowledge dependence are the three themes that I'd like to pursue. First, the issue of complexity. The Industrial Revolution made technology supreme by giving us mass production based on two fundamental principles. The principles have to do with the division of labor and standardization or interchangeability of components. These are closely related. The products of technology are decomposable into component parts that are independently specifiable in terms of their function and the function that they can perform, and they can be used in any sample of the manufactured product. That's what makes mass production possible. And because of this, it's possible to have such components designed and manufactured by specialists and then independently assembled at another time. This idea is important in part because it leads to high productivity, but maybe even more important than this is that it increases the two principles together make possible a certain kind of accumulation of complexity, which has never before been seen, never before the 20th century. Before the widespread adoption of these principles, the overall complexity of a project was limited to what could be conceived in the mind of a master designer, and this even goes for the great pyramids and the wonderful cathedrals of Europe. Nowadays, no single person has more than a highly sketchy understanding of the major products of technology. These two elements, interchangeability and division of labor, I refer to as the modularity of technology. They've had an effect on every phase of modern life. In fact, it might be argued that Gutenberg's invention of the movable type is an instance of the discovery of just this sort of modularity. In recent times, a more self-conscious and systematic, structured version of modularity has been developed to help organize large, complex projects. For example, much of the dramatic success of modern technology can be attributed to the exploitation of this idea. There's very little in the way of new scientific principles or discoveries that went into the contemporary space program. It's essentially classical physics that goes back to Newton and Hamilton. The dramatic achievements in such things as landing a person on the moon is due entirely to the development of means for organizing complexity, for carrying the principles of modularity and division of labor to its extreme. Now, this brings me to the relevance of computation, because one of the fundamental characteristics of computer system design is that it makes the idea of the modular and hierarchical organization of complexity into a fundamental prescriptive principle, and it capitalizes on it to create enormously complex systems, yet systems that are still understandable and even repairable if they should fail to work properly. One way in which computing makes possible an extreme degree of modularity is worth examining because it sheds some light on this notion of organization. And the organization and the levels of organization of computing is going to be one of the themes that will recur in my talk. Computer systems are typically designed by first implementing a set of general-purpose facilities in hardware, then another independently designed facility in the form, for example, of an interpreter for some programming language. Such facilities are specifically designed to suppress certain logistical details from the person who is concerned with the design of a system for some particular application. So you design a system in some high-level programming language, say BASIC or Fortran or Lisp. You can design it, concentrate on the concerns of the particular task in mind with no idea of how those particular facilities are implemented at another level. Such an individual who designs such products almost never knows in detail how the computer electronically carries out the sequence of commands. Similarly, a designer can also use the computer language layer to create a new set of tools, say a database management system, which another designer can subsequently use to design still other complex systems with no knowledge of how the facilities he's using are realized at the lower level. This deliberate suppression of detail is crucial to the growth of complexity because it allows different designers to concentrate on a natural class of functions, those that are relevant to their concerns. This layering principle is fundamental to computer design and is carried to an extreme in such applications as the setting of standards for certain large-scale cooperative ventures, such as intercomputer communications. You may be familiar with the 7 standard layers for computer communication. The point of this layering is to provide a way to mediate between the diversity of specific machines and different forms of information transmission on the one hand, and the need for identical standards on the other. And the layering is just the idea of interchangeability of components and division of labor raised to a high art in response to the enormous complexity of modern technological artifacts. It's the fact that technical objects can be organized in terms of this kind of conceptual layering that makes it possible for people to have sufficient understanding of such devices to operate them, repair them, and even to design them. This hierarchical style of design is both extremely natural for computing, for reasons having to do with the ease with which computers allow functions to be composed, put together from some sub-functions. And at the same time, it's the reason why computer systems can grow to such enormous complexity. This, in turn, is one of the factors that has contributed to the recent success of artificial intelligence. There are a number of contemporary developments that have made artificial intelligence rather successful in a relatively short period of time. I mean, people have been doing AI in laboratories for 25 years, but it's only in the last half dozen or so years that one hears about commercial successes. The researchers now have tools, that is to say, they have some of the layers with which to build systems whose complexity is sufficient to begin to produce behavior that we consider intelligent. Those who remember the good old days of the early 60s, it's supposed to show how the early history of artificial intelligence is very recent, will recognize that programs such as the General Problem Solver, early 60s, were a very small fraction of the size of such current AI expert systems as some of the ones I will mention later, XCon and MySyn, a medical diagnostic system, and Internist. And this is critical because one of the lessons that has been learned in the past several dozen years is that intelligence arises primarily from the interaction of a large number of basic parts. See, my background is in physics, and I'm interested in what it is that makes psychology seem so complicated and so hard. And one thing that we find, and I'm not sure that I know the fundamental reason for this, is that in contrast with physics, cognition, exercise of intelligence, appears to have few general powerful laws. Whatever else is required for the exercise of intelligence, it appears that one thing that is required is a large number of transactions on a knowledge base. To a first approximation, to be intelligent is to know a lot and to be able to access the knowledge when it's appropriate. For example, the commercial expert systems, which today are just idiot savants, are large. XCon, which helps to put together designs for computer systems, has 2,500 elementary rules. That's not 2,500 lines of code. These are separate rules that have to be extracted from an expert. An Internist, which is a medical diagnosis system for internal diseases, is said to have nearly 100 times as much. And yet they're still idiot savant and perform intelligently over a very narrow range of problems. Clearly, AI is dealing with large numbers. And without some general scheme for keeping control of such quantities, the design of the whole system would soon lose its way. Before I launch into my central point about computers and knowledge, which is really the primary theme, I'd like to sketch one additional property of computing that distinguishes it from other complex artifacts. I do this by going back a bit in history to the origins of some of the ideas that form the foundation of computing. Alan Turing was a brilliant mathematician, interested in exploring the limits of mathematics. In the process, he had to define the notion of mechanism. He wanted to know whether certain things were realizable in an entirely mechanical way, in the sense that it doesn't require intelligence, you just follow rules. But of course, to make that precise, one has to make precise what it means to follow rules mechanically. To do that, he had to define a mechanism. It became called, it's a very simple and ingenious thing, it became called the Turing machine. It's a very, very simple idea. Now, what Turing discovered was that such an extremely simple device has a remarkable property, the property which is called universality, by which Turing meant that one can design a particular such Turing machine in such a way that by varying the symbols that it reads in its input, it can be made to behave like any possible symbol manipulating machine. In other words, a universal Turing machine can simulate every conceivable symbol processing mechanism without changing its basic structure. Since every computer you buy nowadays is a variant of a Turing machine, it's a more complicated version of it, this result is also true of all our computers. They can be made to carry out any mechanically specified function. This is another way of saying what most people know about computers, namely that they can be programmable. They can be programmed to carry out almost any function we know how to describe in the right way. Now, this is an extreme plasticity or variability of behavior. And it's one of the reasons initially why computers have been viewed as artifacts that might be capable of exhibiting intelligence. The early papers on the relationship between computing and intelligence go back to before there were computers. And they go back to this basic idea that Turing discovered, that you can program a simple device to do whatever you want. Well, it's not quite true, there are limits, but you can program it to execute any function that can be specifiable in its formalism. Now, what I'm leading up to is the following, that people who weren't familiar with this basic idea frequently misunderstood the capacity of machines. For example, the Gestalt psychologist Wolfgang Köhler viewed machines as too rigid to serve as models of biological and mental activity. The latter, he claimed, were governed by what he called dynamic factors, an example of which are sort of self-distributing field effects. So if you have some magnets and then you put a piece of metal in the middle, the magnetic field gets redistributed everywhere in sort of a dynamic way. And he thought maybe the brain would have to be explained in terms of those kinds of principles instead of principles based on rigidly structured mechanisms. He contrasted these dynamic factors with what he called topographical factors. And he said he didn't think that we could do it with these topographically constrained machines, because he believed that to the degree that which topographical conditions are rigidly given and not to be changed, their existence means the exclusion of certain forms of function and the restriction of the process to the possibilities compatible with those conditions. I won't read the rest of it. But what Turing showed is that computers violate this claim. And it's one of their most important and unique characteristics. The topographical structure, the wiring of a computer is completely rigid, yet it's capable of maximum plasticity or maximum variability of function. And it's this property that led Turing in 1951 to write a paper speculating that computers would be able, in principle, to exhibit intelligent behavior. The combination of extreme plasticity of function together with an organization that gives rise to the orderly growth of complexity due to this layering I talked about, make computers a powerful new form of technology. Now, I'm going to come back to the reason for this plasticity in a few minutes, because it's related to this knowledge dependence. First, I want to introduce what, in my view, is the aspect of computers that establishes them as the most radical departure from the lineal descendants of early Homo sapien tools. Roughly speaking, it's the fact that computers, like people, can be made to act on the content of information that they are given. Since this is not a familiar idea, I'm going to devote the remainder of the talk to discussing this claim and its ramifications. It's commonplace nowadays to accept computers as a major new medium for storage, transmission, and transformation of information. And it's becoming clear to everyone now, as it wasn't when I first started teaching computer science many years ago, that computers aren't just lightning-fast calculators, but information handlers. Nonetheless, it's not generally appreciated exactly how the information handling capacity of a computer is different, except for possibly the speed and efficiency, from the information handling capacity of a lot of other things that we know. For example, books, files, tape recorders, telephones, libraries, television sets, and so on, all of which, in some sense, store, transmit, and transform information. But that it is different should be abundantly clear, because computers, unlike books or even television sets, do things. And they do things because of the particular information that they contain. Moreover, the nature of the behavior that they exhibit appears to be directly attributable to the content of the information that they have. That is, what the information is about. This isn't true for any other information handling system we can think of, with the obvious exception of people and higher organisms. Now, this observation is fundamental, and it requires some elaboration. The right place, by the way, to get the elaboration is to buy my book, Computation and Cognition, because it does, there are a lot of subtle objections that one has to deal with. But let me try to sketch it. Those who work with computers know that they can be coherently and consistently described as behaving in certain ways because of what they know, or because they have representations of certain things. For example, a programmer might say that the computer predicted a rise in corporate spending at a certain time because it, quote, has an econometric model, or that it was told the current values of certain parameters. Or they might say that the computer printed a check for so many dollars because it knows what the individual's salary is and what deductions have to be made according to the contract and the income tax law. Or the programmer might also say, correctly, that a computer made a certain chess move because it did so, quote, in order to avoid having its knight captured by the opponent's queen. A more complex computer system, say one which diagnoses infectious diseases, an example of which is the Pylyshyn system, might be described as inferring that a patient has a certain infection and recommending a particular treatment based on its knowledge of the symptoms and of the action of certain drugs. Indeed, the successor to Pylyshyn, a system called Tiresias, will even explain to the physician how it came to its decision by citing certain things that it believes and certain inferential processes that it carried out. The question, however, that remains is whether these sorts of descriptions are just convenient anthropomorphisms. We're just kidding ourselves, like saying, for example, that the thermostat believes the room is too cold, so it turns on the furnace. It's beginning to look very much like the answer to the question is no. That is, it's not the same as the thermostat case. For one thing, you can exclude such artifacts as thermostat quite easily on the basis of a version of Occam's razor, which an extension known to biologists as De Morgan's canon, which says you don't attribute phylogenetically higher capacities to a system when lower ones will suffice. In the case of devices like thermostats, nothing whatever is lost in describing its functioning in physical terms. All its regularities are adequately captured in an electromechanical description, with no need to refer to goals, beliefs, knowledge, and so on. In such cases, there is no genuine level of organization or functioning beyond the electromechanical. But this is simply not the case for higher organisms. And it turns out not to be the case for the kinds of artifacts being designed in artificial intelligence. Such machines exhibit systematic patterns of behavior that could not adequately be captured by describing their physical structure. These regularities must be described as being governed by internal symbolic representations. In other words, their behavior is dependent on the knowledge that is encoded in them. Now, I don't know how this strikes you, but usually when I say this, people look at me with some suspicion, so I'd better take a few minutes to hint at why this is so, or at least to suggest that it needn't be mystical or that it doesn't imply dualism. Let me make a very simple point about patterns. Regular patterns of behavior sometimes can't be explained by giving the structure of the system that exhibits this behavior. A very simple example in which the pattern can only be understood if we take into account what the internal states represent, that they're symbols. All right? Suppose I show you a black box. This is, by the way, not an example of an artificial intelligence system. What I'm going to show you is an example to illustrate this simple point. If you know a regular pattern of behavior of something, then you can't necessarily explain it by knowing how it's structured. And conversely, if you want to produce a system with a certain regularity in its behavior, the design can't always be accomplished by specifying its physical properties. You might have to specify another level of organization that refers to symbols. So here's the simple idea. I show you a black box in which I've inserted an electrode. Well, that box, I'm not saying what it contains. Could be a brain. We observe the box go through its usual function, and we make a record of it, and we notice that the record has certain regularities. For example, we observe that either individual short pulses or pairs of such short pulses frequently occur in the record, and that when there are both pairs and single pulses, as sometimes happens, the pair appears to regularly precede the single pulse. After observing this pattern for some time, we discover that there are occasional exceptions to this order, but only when the whole pattern is preceded by a pair of long and short pulse sequences. That's the regularity. And no matter how long we observe it, that regularity, as I stated it, keeps applying. Being scientists, we're most interested in giving an explanation of this irregularity. What kind of explanation is appropriate? What causes this pattern? Well, the answer depends on what sort of device this black box is, and in particular on what its capacity is beyond the particular behavior we've just been observing. Not only what it's doing or what it typically does, but what it could be doing in certain counterfactual situations. See, in this particular example, which I chose just for a pedagogical point, I can confidently tell you that you won't find the explanation for its behavior in its internal structure, nor in any properties intrinsic to that box or its contents. Now, if that strikes you as an odd claim, how can the behavior of a system not be explainable in terms of its internal physical construction and its inherent properties? What else could it be? Well, of course, I'm not trying to pull the wool over your eyes, because in the end it's the existence of certain properties in the box that govern the totality of its possible behavior. But as long as we've only sampled a limited scope, for example, what it usually does in typical environments, we may not be in a position to infer what its intrinsically constrained capacity is, and hence the observed regularity may tell us nothing about the internal structure or the inherent properties of this device. Okay, now to make the point concrete, I can now reveal to you that the reason the black box exhibits this regularity is simply that what it's doing is processing and transmitting English words encoded in international Morse code. And the regularity we've discovered is not a direct result of the structure of the box at all, but it's attributable entirely to a spelling rule of English, that is to say, I before E except after C. The reason that providing a detailed description of the component structure and the operation of the box wouldn't explain this regularity is that the structure is capable of exhibiting a much greater range of behaviors. So the observed pattern is not due to its intrinsic capability, but to what its states are representing. Since computers, as I've already suggested, are extreme in their flexibility, in the range of behaviors they're capable of exhibiting, most of its regularities are due to not to structural properties, but to representations. Okay, now I'm going to give you some more examples that aren't quite so trivial to illustrate a similar point. I'll try to make this point by asking what is needed in order to design a system which exhibits a certain pattern of behavior, rather than, in this case, what do we need to know in order to explain its behavior. In fact, explaining and designing are much more closely related activities than most people are willing to admit, which is one reason I maintain that the role of technology in shaping our understanding of the world has been underrated. Okay, the examples I'm going to sketch for you are miniature problems that occur in systems that are in this category of artificial intelligence. And here I'm going to just look at some slides and improvise. This is an example taken from a speech recognition system called Hearsay. The waveform is shown at the bottom. I can't see it very well from here, but I assume that you can see it. The waveform is shown over here. That's the waveform, in fact, for, I don't know, can you read that? It says all about. All about is what that's the waveform for. If one starts to try to recognize that in segments, break it into segments, this segment corresponding to all is linguistic or acoustically compatible with AW, AW, or O. This part here is compatible with AH, L, or R. L, by the way, is a fluent whose acoustical properties vary tremendously depending on the context. So this segment has a variety of possible interpretations. The ambiguity at this level is quite enormous. There are various things that it could be if you just analyze its local acoustical properties. Up here, which I can't read at all, you've got a whole series of possible, at the phone level, possible sounds that this could be, or phone clusters, as they're called phones at this level. So at an even higher level, it turns out that this sound could have been made by R about, all about, R. I can't see that at all, but I think that if you're standing in front of it, you can see the various possible words that could have been. It's not a poverty in the analysis that produces this ambiguity. That's what the information gives you. That is, there are contexts in which this same sound pattern could be any of those possibilities. How does one decide which one it is? Well, the answer is that one, in order to do this kind of recognition, one has to know something about what is being said. One has to know something about whether in this particular junction you can have a verb followed by a preposition, or whether you can have other kinds of parts of speech. So the syntax is relevant to deciding among these ambiguities which are inherent in the signal. Knowledge, in other words, is required to decide what sound, what words or what intended words produce those sounds. Here's an example from the analysis of language. If one wants to one of the things that one wants to do in natural language is to be able to understand sentences. The question is, if you wanted to design a system that understood sentences like this, what would you have to build into it? Would you have to build in a very complicated electronic circuit, or is something else required? Well, here's an example. In order to understand that sentence, you have to be able to recover what's called its thematic structure. You have to know who did what to whom, at minimum. In order to do that, you have to know what the pronoun refers to, they. What does they refer to? Well, if you look down here, you'll see that if the sentence ends in communist, worried, rowdy, from out of town, in a hurry, up for re-election, in each case, they refers to different things. If I gave you just one of those sentences, the city councilors refused to give the workers a permit for holding a demonstration because they were rowdy, it wouldn't occur to you that there was any problem in deciding what they refers to. You know immediately what it refers to. But then you ask yourself, what determined the referent to they? And the answer has to be anything that you know. You know something about our culture, you know something about what city councilors are like, you know something what workers are like. It may be that you remember something that you read in the day's news or something that somebody told you. Anything is relevant. That decision, which in the first instance is crucial for understanding the sentence, depends on knowledge. It can't be a mechanism that's wired up once and for all, because it can vary. I got a dramatic illustration of how this can vary when I used a version of this in a talk that I gave once before. It only had the first two. Because they were worried, because they were communists, and because, what was it? Because they were communists and because they were rowdy. I gave this talk in Florence, Italy, and there was enough problems with the translation, but it turned out that the example that I used, the force of the example was completely lost, because what I didn't know is that the City Council of Florence is made up of the Communist Party. It's facts like this that we have to use in order to understand a sentence, in order to do one particular part of understanding a sentence, only assigning pronouns. We have to use it for all sorts of other things, especially whenever there is anaphora, whenever you're making an indefinite reference to something. You have to use things that you know. You use it very quickly and not consciously. But without that, you can't understand it. A system designed to understand language is a system that has to deal with knowledge, has to make inferences from arbitrary knowledge that it might have, without bounds. This is an example. You might think that, okay, language assigning references is something that one obviously needs a knowledge for. But how about just understanding pictures? This may not be a very good picture. For example, there's an airport there. Now, how do we know that? Is it on the basis of lines? Is it on the basis of other kinds of facts? Well, let's look a bit more carefully. Supposing we zoom in at the top of that photograph. It turns out that this is a photograph of some ships. Now, supposing you're looking for ships. How do you know what to look for? Well, there are two alternative ways of approaching that. One is to discover some physical correlate in the image that is invariably associated with the presence of a ship. If you're lucky to find such a thing, which would be called the signature of what you're looking for, then that's the right way to do it. And it turns out that there are signatures for a number of things. I believe that ground moisture can be found that way, and there are other things that can be located that way, and MDA has been very successful in locating signatures of certain kinds of properties from aerial photographs. But not everything has signatures, and particularly man-made things very often don't, because what we're looking for are things that have certain functional properties. Ships are things that sail, and they don't always have physical signatures in some part of the spectrum. But a photo interpreter has no problem in locating that, because he looks at it and he says, well, those are docks, and ships tend to be found in water by the side of docks, so we'll look where that is. But how do you know that that's a dock? Well, what you do is you go back to the previous photograph and you try to decide which was land and which was water. If you know which is land and which is water, then you know that rectangular protrusions from the land tend to be docks, and the things that are near those rectangular protrusions might be ships. But how do you know which is land and how do you know which is water? Well, there are things that there is a reasoning process that you go through. There are certain things that you find on land that you don't find on water. For example, roads. But on the other hand, roads are just squiggles on this. How can you tell which squiggle is a road? Well, there are patterns of consistencies that have to hold. If you decide that something is a road, for example, if you decide that something is a boundary between water and land, and so on the left is water and on the right is land, you follow that boundary along, it must continue to be the case that what's on the left is water and what's on the right is land. That's a piece of information that you know intuitively, but the machine has to be told that and it has to use that. Photo interpretation has to be a knowledge-based process. Let me give you an example closer to home on the very same point. You might think that if you can only get clear lines, everything would be fine. If you can only get clear edges. Well, there are sub-problems that exist even when you have clear edges. This is a photograph of the Lower Mainland, and it's part of the research project that's being done at UBC. Alan Mackworth, Bill Havens, and Jan Mulder are working on a system called MAPSEA. This is just the outline of the area. Supposing we set ourselves a very simple problem. Tell me which is land, tell me which is water, tell me which of those lines are boundaries between water and land, and which of them are roads, and which of them are rivers. Well, if you introspect in what you're doing, you might discover that you're reasoning. You might discover that you're saying that roads have certain properties. For example, roads have X junctions. Rivers don't. They don't cross one another. You might decide that if something is either a river or a road, then something else that connects to it must be either a road or a river. You might have conjunction kind of constraints that hold over it. The system, the MAPSEA system, in fact, reasons just like that and is able to come to an interpretation. The point is that seeing involves using knowledge. You ask somebody how they saw what they saw, and they will say, well, I just opened my eyes and looked. And if you open your eyes and, this is the output of the, not very clear, but this is what the MAPSEA system does. In fact, it does make decisions about which is land, which is water, and which are roads. It has trouble at the bottom, the purple one, that hasn't been able to decide, not for fault of its own, but because the picture is cut off at that point, and so there's no way to tell whether that protrusion actually connects to water or whether it doesn't. So it's either land or water. So that could be a road, you see. You need extra evidence to be able to sort that out. Now, here's a picture that you can see just by looking. At least most people can see just by looking. What goes into this looking? Well, I claim that what goes into it is knowing a lot. We can't say exactly what it is, what kind of knowledge is involved. That's a problem for experimental psychologists. But knowledge is involved, because if you didn't know about Dalmatians, and if you didn't have a general idea about dogs, you might not be able to see that. In fact, I doubt very much if you hadn't ever seen a dog before. I mean, you have to be living in a very strange place, but if you came from a place that had never seen a dog, you wouldn't be able to see that. The theory that what's involved in vision is merely looking, there's a certain amount of truth to that, because after all, you do open your eyes and you see things. One of the problems that psychologists have always had with trying to build theories of vision is that before you can build a theory of it, you have to find a puzzle. And it's very hard to find a puzzle for something that comes so naturally as just opening your eyes and looking. It seems that the right answer for why you see what you see is that that's the way it really is. In fact, if we tried to build a theory around this naive conception that the way that vision proceeds is that you merely look, what you would end up with is a theory that's illustrated by this cartoon of Clibbins. This is probably the way the cat sees. It merely looks. Merely looking gives it something, but it isn't something that's of any use for making any further decisions, because all it's got is something inside that's like what was outside. That's not the kind of theory of seeing that we need. The kind of theory of seeing that we need has to be knowledge dependent. Now, it's important to realize that all this talk about how certain regular features of behavior can only be understood in terms of the use of knowledge and the making of inferences and decisions is not just a matter of expedience or convenience. The fact is that there are certain kinds of systems in nature whose behavior is explainable only if we take into account the organization that they have at a certain level, namely the level at which we can describe them as having representations or as having knowledge or as having goals. No matter how accurately and completely you describe the physical or neurological structure, you would still not understand why they display the particular patterns of behavior unless you also took into account this particular level of organization. And by the way, the existence of this level of organization is closely connected to my earlier point about the behavioral plasticity of certain systems. An important reason why we need to postulate representations in order to account for behavior is because of the enormous plasticity of human behavior. Psychologists who conduct laboratory experiments on humans have to take extraordinary precautions in the way they instruct subjects and the way they set up the conditions of such experiments. The reason is that the behavioral regularities that subjects exhibit are very sensitive to what the subjects believe, which in turn are influenced by the content of any information or any clues. Whatever regularities in behavior we might observe under some set of conditions can be altered in a systematic and a logically coherent way by merely providing the subject with certain information, by telling or showing them something, or providing clues which together with other beliefs warrant some plausible inference. That's why behavioral regularities are so hard to find in a laboratory, because humans are at least as flexible as Turing machines. Let me give you an example. A colleague of mine went through the literature trying to find reliable regular behaviors. What can be more regular than a conditioned reflex? Take a very simple conditioned reflex. You have a subject put their finger on a metal plate, and there's another metal plate above. Subject puts his finger on the metal plate, a buzz is heard. Immediately after the buzz, he is shocked on this plate. So he withdraws his finger. That's called conditioned withdrawal. We psychologists have technical terms for very small effect. Supposing we took another control experiment and we conditioned subjects with the top electrode. So the subject holds his finger up and the buzz is heard and then he's shocked on the top. So that subject learns to move his finger down. Now what has happened? Have we demonstrated a regularity? This is as reliable a regularity as you're going to find, by the way. I mean, this goes back to Pavlov's conditioned reflexes. Now it turns out that a much better explanation than conditioned reflexes for this behavior is that the buzz tells the subject what's going to happen. The subject believes that the experimenter is going to zap him if he keeps his finger on that place. So when he hears the buzz, he removes his finger. Now, that sounds like a sensible explanation, doesn't it? Well, here's the critical test for it. The critical test. You don't need conditioning. What you do is you do this conditioning. Say you do several trials of conditioning, and you find the subject lifts his finger every time the buzz occurs. Now we're going to do an experiment to decondition the subject. Do we have to have more trials in which the buzz occurs and the subject lifts his finger and doesn't receive shock? No, we don't need that at all. All we need is for the subject to be looking on to the experiment while the experimenter removes the wires from the bottom electrode, connects them to the top electrode, and says, okay, now we're going to do the second part of the experiment. What do you suppose happens? At the sound of the buzz, the subject no longer lifts his finger onto the top electrode, which he now sees is connected to the wire. He does the opposite. Now that's what seems to be that's what I mean by plasticity of behavior. Irregularity, no matter how reliable it seems to be, can be changed in a completely rational way by providing information. Now, the only system that we know that has the kind of plasticity to change its regular behavior in arbitrary ways is a Turing machine. Now, there are two ways that you can deal with this radical plasticity of human behavior. One is to conclude that rigorous prediction in the science of psychology isn't possible, and so you resign yourself to predicting statistical properties of behavior, and a lot of people have done this. In fact, I was just talking to somebody at the UBC psychology department yesterday who took this view. Or there is another thing that you can do. You can conclude that we've been on the wrong track by the kinds of models that we've had, and that we shouldn't have deterministic models or mechanistic models. We should have something, different kind of mechanism. And of course, that's what Wolfgang Köhler concluded in that example I cited earlier, when he felt that mechanical or mechanistic models were too constrained in their behavior by their structure or by their topographical factors. But as Turing showed, Köhler was completely mistaken in this view, because Turing was able to prove that a completely constrained, completely fixed topography was compatible with arbitrary plasticity of behavior. What I didn't mention when I discussed that before is that in order to prove the universality of the simple Turing machine, Turing had to introduce the idea of symbols and hence of representation, because in order to simulate another machine, the universal machine has to have some representation of the machine to be simulated. For example, it has to be given in some symbolic form the instructions that the other machine would have performed. So what was missing in Köhler's analysis was the notion that a machine could have another level of organization, one in which it's described as having and using symbols and hence representations. So that's the clue to plasticity. Now, finally, I want to conclude by saying something about this notion of cognizing that I've used. Let me put it this way. The qualitative growth in complexity and speed of information handling that computers have made possible has been more generally recognized than has their character as knowledge processor, which is a newer idea. The capacity which enables them to act on the content of knowledge. At the turn of the century, philosopher psychologist Franz Brentano argued that the mark of the mental, and consequently the mark of the uniquely human, was the possession of what he called intentionality. And by this technical term, what he meant was the fact that mental states are about something. They have what we would call representational content. And when you have a thought, it isn't just a pattern, it's a thought about something. And this aboutness mystified people. It's not, I shouldn't put that in the past tense. The intentionality, the aboutness of mental states, in fact, continues to be a very deep problem in the philosophy of mind. Nonetheless, many of us believe that whatever is the resolution or the proper analysis of this notion, it'll include features of what computers do as well as what the mind does. Indeed, computers are the only non-living systems we know which appear to support a level of organization that corresponds to having and using representations, and hence that correspond closely to what Brentano called intentionality. Now, there's an important point here if this analysis is correct. Revolutionary changes in man's view of the world frequently have had the character of discovering new groupings of phenomena, groupings that philosophers called natural kinds. For example, the discovery that violent motion and natural motion are not different kinds of phenomena subject to different principles, as Aristotle taught and everyone believed for 1,500 years. It was one of the first steps in the development of the new physics. It went hand in hand with the reclassification of the motion of heavenly bodies into the same category as the motion of middle-sized objects like stones and cannonballs. See, the modern concept of a physical object as anything that has mass and location, whether or not it's visible, or whether it's detectable even in principle, or whether it's moving or at rest, that notion of physical object seems so natural for us today. This wasn't always the case. In fact, Galileo was ridiculed, and perhaps rightly so in his day, for the assumption that the things he could see through a special artifact, through a special instrument, the telescope. He assumed that the things he could see through this instrument were the same natural kinds as things that you could see with the naked eye. I mean, people argued that you had no right to that assumption because, after all, this is an object I can see. This is an object that's created by this instrument. Why should I count them to be in the same category? Well, classing the two things in the same category was an enormous conceptual leap. It's a leap of seeing a new fundamental grouping of things. And in fact, the only thing that vindicated this grouping was the fact that a physics built on this view, a physics in which laws applied to middle-sized objects, in principle invisible objects like electrons, and stellar objects, a physics that applied to all of them, unified everything. There was one set of principles that were required, not three. Now, here's my point about this. What people who work in the field of artificial intelligence and cognitive science believe is that certain aspects of human capacity must also be regrouped or reconceptualized. Man has been variously understood as a creature of special creation, as a social animal, and in the late 19th century as a biological object. What some of us now believe is that there's another natural category to which cognition or rational action should be assigned. This category is one that includes certain sorts of machines as members in good standing, machines whose behavior is governed by what they represent or by what they know. These are knowledge-driven systems. George Miller has a picturesque term for them, a term that is analogous to carnivore. He calls them informavores, systems that are nourished and guided by information. Now, if this regrouping or reconceptualization is correct, it means that certain forms of human behavior should be explained in precisely the same way that we explain certain forms of computer behavior. So, contrary to a widely held view, even within my field, the computer is not a metaphor for mind, any more than mathematical structures are a metaphor for the physical world, as that quote from Freeman Dyson suggested, or any more than geometry was a metaphor for space for Galileo. Rather, it's a bold but literal hypothesis. Computing is a literal description of aspects of cognition stated in terms of a more manageable member of the same natural kind. Let me make a point about this geometry one, because I think that the relationship between, computing to cognition is very much like geometry was to physics. Geometry is very old. It was used as a method of measurement by the Egyptians. Just a method of calculation, the way computers are used for calculation. For the Greeks, for Euclid, geometry was a description of a perfect Platonic world, of which this world that we see is but a shadow. Because after all, the objects of geometry, straight lines, squares, circles, they don't exist in this world. There are no things in this world like lines. Line has zero thickness and perfect straightness. So there's something very idealistic about the objects of geometry. And they were used as, it was a very aesthetic experience to work with them in times of ancient Greece. What happened for the first time, what started with Galileo, is that he took seriously the possibility that geometry actually described this world. Now that's hard for us it's hard for us to imagine how it might be otherwise, because we think of space as being a totally empty place. Place isn't even the right word. It's a receptacle that contains places and in which you can think of distances between places, where distances are lengths of straight lines. Those are all natural notions. But they're only natural because we've lived with them for several hundred years. For Galileo, they weren't natural, and for the Aristotelians, it wasn't natural, because geometry was not about the real world. Galileo took it to be about the real world, so he took seriously the possibility that, so for example, Pythagoras' theorem actually applied to the world. So if you paced off 3 paces in one direction and 4 paces at right angles to that, the distance between the endpoints would have to be 5 paces. And if you measured it and it came to 4.9, it was the measurement that was wrong, because geometry was right, because geometry was about the real world. I'm trying to make this point in order to give you a feeling for the dramatic change in conceptualization that comes with taking something which is initially either a means of calculation or a description of some ideal, taking that to be a description of reality. Now, I take computation, the transformation of symbols, which have an interpretation, which have a semantics, to be a literal description of how the mind works. So this is the new heresy now. Man, the informavore, brother not only to the ape, but to the computer. I'd like to ameliorate the shock of this a little bit by pointing out that this kind of regrouping is really fairly innocuous, because, I mean, after all, the idea is what we're trying to do is to find groups of phenomena that share common principles, because then you can study them as a group. So the fact that somebody puts Q in the same category as a paramecium ought not to be insulting to you, because he's not saying you're a mere paramecium. He's saying that there are certain biological principles of growth, of principles of embryology, or whatever other biological principles apply, that you both share. Nor should you be offended if somebody says to you, well, with respect to some of your behavior, you're in the same category as a stone. Because after all, if you step off the top floor of a building, your behavior is correctly described as accelerating at a constant acceleration of 32 feet per second. And so is the stone's. So if somebody says that you are in the same category with respect to knowledge-dependent processes as computational devices, shouldn't be offended by that either, because the word mere doesn't occur there. It's not to say that we are mere computers, but there's to say that there's an interesting natural category of phenomena, natural category of behaviors. When I say natural category, it means that it's a set of behaviors about which there could be a science, a set of uniform principles. There's a natural category of behaviors which we have roughly characterized as cognition, knowledge-dependent processing, that we share with computers. Now, if all this turns out to be true and the new natural kind becomes assimilated to the general view, as did the Galilean categories over the Aristotelian ones, we're going to be witnessing a revolution in our image of man. And perhaps even a greater revolution than the Darwinian or the Freudian, both of which caused us a serious revaluation of aspects of human nature. We'll also be witnessing a revolutionary change in the nature of our environment as we extend ourselves electronically, because the extension will be unlike that brought about by the electronic communication medium, which McLuhan characterized as an extension of our senses. This new extension will literally place replicas of some of our most cherished functions, like thinking, deciding, recommending, evaluating, pursuing goals. It'll place those out in the environment along with other people and animals. And as autonomous gatherers and exploiters of knowledge, they'll represent a new, and it will take us a while to understand them, a new form of intellectual activity. So although in a sense they'll still be tools, they'll also be active participants in our intellectual activity. And we'll have to learn to live with them on those terms. Thank you.
We will have a question period, which will start by going to room 6. The questions will be heard in this room because we'll ask the speakers in the other room to use the microphone. But it's a two-way communication situation, so we'd appreciate it if those of you who stay in the room, which I hope is all of you, will be quiet while we go into the other room. Otherwise, the roar from this room makes it so you can't hear anything in that room. So
where do I have to go?
You will come with me to meet the people in the next room. We'll be back shortly.
Is this all?
Just 6.
I was asked to stand and glare at you, anticipating that with your knowledge you'd realize it was because you were making a noise, and then you would not make a noise.
We will entertain questions in this room briefly. If you have questions, could you come forward?
How about coming forward if you don't have questions?
Well, thank you all very much. We'll return to the other room. I hope we've given the people in the other room a chance to come up with... we have a question.
Thank you. What do you think is the likelihood of being superseded by machine intelligence?
I have trouble with questions that have a horizon, what's the likelihood of our being superseded by machine intelligence? If you mean for specific tasks in narrow domains, I think that's very likely. In fact, it's probably the case now. But if you mean in general intelligence, that's just beyond the horizon that I look forward to. I mean, the problem is that discussions about the future of machine intelligence, the ultimate limits to it, are all highly speculative because there are no arguments about any limitations. No one has an argument about what can't in principle be done. On the other hand, no one has the faintest idea of what even to do to make the IQ, about 12. So there's a very big gap there, and the likelihood of having an intelligence that's greater than ours is something that I just can't estimate. But I don't see any reason why it couldn't happen. Because after all, one of the things that we can do with machines, if we had them intelligent enough, is that we can point out to them where they can go and learn more. And we don't have the time to do it. We can send them off to the best libraries in the world, or we can send them off to get experience so they can know things that we don't know. People have often retreated to the old and true characterization of machines. They can only do what they're told to do. Right. Now, supposing you had a machine that you can tell to go out and learn something. There's no reason why being a machine that can only do what you tell it to do can't be told to do things that result in it knowing things that you don't know. As long as it can interact with parts of the world that you haven't interacted with. So there's no, in principle, limitation. But I don't know whether that'll happen or not. I don't know. I mean, one just doesn't know what lies 25 years ahead.
Just going on from that, what about other limits that couldn't be duplicated by a machine, which are related to intelligence, such as imagination? I mean, where's the borderline between intelligence? Let's assume there isn't a limit to what a machine can do with respect to intelligence, but we all know that in the creative activity, imagination and lateral thinking are so closely related. Now, would you see a limitation there to what a machine could do?
Sure. There is one kind of a limitation imposed on machines. We can't have machines do things if we don't know what those things are. And lateral thinking and creativity and so on, we don't have enough of an understanding of what that constitutes in order to talk about whether a machine can do it or not. There are things, for example, that I have some concern about whether machines will be able to do. Machines don't develop the way human organisms do. They don't have social history. They don't have, since they haven't interacted with the world, they don't have the same kind of experiential memories. I don't know whether one can put them into the state corresponding to that, to having that kind of a memory or not, but they certainly won't have a personal history unless they're robots that walk around. So anything that depends crucially on that, they won't have. But I don't know what depends crucially on that. If you ask whether they'll be creative, I don't know. You tell me exactly what constitutes creativity, and maybe I can speculate on that. If what constitutes creativity is to think of things that you haven't thought of or no one had thought of before, they can do that. In fact, all my programs which have bugs in them do exactly that. But that's not, I assume that's not the kind of creativity that you want. You're interested in a creativity that somehow is a reformulation, a reconceptualization which is useful and interesting. And I think parts of it can do, and parts of it can't. There are now systems that do invention in mathematics. They invent new ideas. And so some people like to think of them as being creative. The only problem is that they actually only do part of that. What they do is they come up with new combinations, but the evaluation dimension of which one is worth considering and which one isn't has actually been imposed on it by somebody who has a feeling for what kind of mathematics is important and what isn't. So that's not a counterexample of a machine that's being creative. I have trouble with questions like creativity because I don't think that we know very much about what it is.
Yeah, two more questions.
We all know that computers are essentially serial machines and that perhaps mind is essentially a parallel processor. What do you think is the future of emulating natural systems in artificial intelligence as opposed to the current method of trying to find ways around that?
I'm quite sure that a lot of artificial intelligence, not even far down the road, but fairly soon down the road, is going to be done on machines that have a lot of parallelism. But I'm not sure that that's because it's getting closer to simulating brain activity. In fact, I don't even know how much of brain activity is parallel. The fact that many things happen at the same time in different places in the brain is not evidence that the brain operates in parallel, because that's true of the VAX too. I mean, the VAX computer is a highly serial machine, but if you took measurements all over, you'd find that things are happening at the same time. A lot of things in cognition are certainly parallel. But there are other things that seem intrinsically to have to be serial. And I think that some of the bottlenecks in artificial intelligence may well be overcome with a lot more parallelness. But right now, the problem with parallel computation isn't that we don't know how to make parallel computers. That's trivial. The problem is when you make one, what do you do with it? No one knows how to use parallelness appropriately, and that's something that a lot of people are working on. So I share your intuition that there's going to be a lot of parallel processing, although I think the reason for it may not be because we see a lot of it in neuroscience. The reason might be that there's independent reasons based on complexity arguments that there's going to have to be parallelness.
I think we better return to the other room, but I think you're all free to come over to the other room. If you probably can get in at the doorway.
I didn't realize there was a group here.
I hope you've all had time to think of some questions. So, here we go.
I think that one feature of intelligence was natural intelligence, and that is the fact that it acts in our self-interest, that it has survival value. Now, a computer only has intelligence if it acts in its own self-interest and gets rid of the programmer, which has happened quite often in science fiction, but I don't think it is quite on the horizon in reality.
Well, certainly not on the horizon, but I'm not sure that acting in, I'm not sure that that's a good definition of intelligence. I mean, I can imagine an intelligence that acts to some other goal. Why does it have to be selfish intelligence?
It has developed in an evolutionary way, and it has
Sure.
developed so because it has promoted survival.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if you wanted that to be part of the definition, then there's no principled reason why you couldn't build that into the machine. But I don't think that's part of the definition. I mean, I think that's orthogonal. That is, if you had a machine that acted, you've heard of Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. If you had a machine that subscribed to the 3 laws of robotics, it would, in a sense, act in the interest of people, because among its main tenets would be that it would never injure a human. I would say that a machine that was subject to the 3 laws of robotics would still be highly intelligent.
The intelligence of a slave, not the intelligence of a master.
Well, yeah, I guess, or maybe the intelligence of a humanitarian, unselfish device.
If all processes of mind are to be reduced to the manipulation of symbols, it seems that one important characteristic of symbols, namely that they can be taken out of the mind and committed to a clay tablet or to a piece of paper, is relevant. Namely, they are representable as physical objects. However, it seems to me that certain processes of mind are not reproducible in the mind of another person or another being without explicit instructions as to how to achieve them. That is my question. What do you mean by symbol? What qualifies as a symbol?
Okay, I understand the problem. There's a problem about public symbols versus private symbols. Usually, when we refer to symbols, we refer to ones that are shared. They're symbols by convention. So a word stands for something because we all agree to use it that way. There is a much more general sense of symbol in which there is a physical property that can be used in order, that can stand in the relationship to another physical property, the relationship of reference. And the relationship of reference can be established between things that don't occur outside the system. So you can have a symbol in the machine that refers to other symbols in the machine, or perhaps refers to things outside. I mean, how the semantic, how that relation of reference is established is a very difficult point that philosophers argue about. But there's no reason why that symbol has to be externalized. I think it's true of us that we have private symbols. I think that we think not in English or in natural language or even in images. I think that the driving force in thoughts is a language of thought. It's a lingua mentis. And the language of thought is the manipulation of symbols, some of which have words attached to them and some of which don't. We divide the world up into concepts, into categories, and each of those have a code in our minds that we can use to think about it. But a very small fraction of them we have names for, because we don't need names unless we're going to talk about them. So, for example, the people who talk about certain kinds of things develop names for concepts that they surely have before they have the name. Wine tasters and interior decorators and so on develop vocabularies for things because it's useful for them to be able to communicate it, but they must have had those categories. They would have those categories even if they didn't talk to other people about it. They'd have internal, private names.
Dr. Pylyshyn, earlier in your lecture you talked about how what a person does depends on his tools. You used the example of a sculptor.
Mm-hmm.
Consider yourself a workman, and let me suggest that you have three baskets of tools. You have hardware, machines, Turing machines. You have software, which would be the Turing machine tape. And you have concepts and more generalized things. As a workman, in these three areas, what's holding you back? Where is the development going to have to come? Do we need better hardware? Or is the hardware good and we need better software? Or is it the concepts that's holding back your field?
I'm not sure of the answer to that. I think in certain areas of artificial intelligence, if I can be frank, in the areas that have to do with general reasoning, for example, if you wanted to simulate the process of scientific induction, that there are fundamental ideas missing. I mean, we need somebody to somehow recast the problem. I think it's going to end up computational, because computation is the only, as my friend Jerry Fodor puts it, it's the only straw afloat. It's the only physical system we know that has the critical property that we need, namely that its behavior is guided by symbols and by the semantic content of representations. So I think that much is optimistic. As to the details of how one gets away from the combinatorial explosion, how one can make decisions about, for example, just the anaphora in that sentence, what they refer to. I said that shows that knowledge is relevant. It's true. It shows that knowledge is relevant. But it also shows that there's no limit to what knowledge might be relevant. Now that means that if you know a lot of things, and we educated people know at least 50,000 words of vocabulary, I don't know how many facts they know. It's very, very large. The problem is that you can't exclude any domain of those facts from being relevant. So that means the problem of deciding artificial intelligence, in some places it's called the frame problem, and I think that we're missing a key idea. So in that respect, I think there are some very difficult problems. In other cases, I think that the development of not hardware per se, but architectures, designs for possible hardwares that we could emulate on regular machines, are not so far away. I think that a lot of work in vision that doesn't require knowledge, a lot of work maybe even in grammatical parsing that can be done without knowledge. There's a lot of the cognitive system is not knowledge dependent. It's a mechanism that works. It's triggered and it does certain kinds of things. For example, it fetches things out of memory. Some of that requires knowledge and problem solving, but some of that occurs because of the way the brain is wired up. Some of that is part of the architecture of the system. That, I think, we have reasonable hope of finding some good solutions in the next 5 or 10 years. But I think that there's still some pretty key ideas missing, and I think that there's some very good theoretical work being done on them, so I don't know whether my pessimism is warranted. I mean, there are people within AI, lots of people in Canada, because we had a shortage of equipment here for many years, and so we spawned a lot of theoreticians. There are a lot of theoreticians in Canada who are doing work on ways of representing and dealing with knowledge, the problem of knowledge representation. So it may be that something is around the horizon, but at the moment I think there are some real key ideas missing.
Am I allowed a frivolous question?
Please.
I understand the computers are a marvelous tool for man, but isn't that not what is missing, but conscience? Why don't you have a computer that works and no, thou must shalt kill man?
Well, but that doesn't require consciousness. Did you mean conscience? Oh, conscience. No, I do not believe that as a matter of a moral precept of mine, I don't believe that machines can ever be moral agents. That is, I don't think they will be held responsible. Someone other than the machine needs to be held responsible, and we have to view it that way and design them in those terms. So I don't think that we need to endow them with conscience, but we do need to endow them, I suppose, when they make decisions with certain values, but they're values that they inherit from us. I don't think there's ever going to be a law written, or there ought not to be laws written, that treat the machine as responsible, because I don't think they should be treated as moral agents.
Professor Pylyshyn, I wonder if you could tell me, in your opinion, the problem of artificial intelligence is to simulate human behavior, or to what degree is it to actually replicate or understand the mechanisms and the sources through which that behavior arises in human beings?
Well, you know, I think I've had arguments with people about that because I think that those are essentially the same goals. There are people who are trying to devise machines that do intelligent things. There are other people that are trying to design machines that do things the way people do them. I think that if the first group were interested not in a narrow problem, but in a general problem, they would end up building it to do it pretty much the way we do it. And the reason for that, it's not, I don't think the reason is all that deep. The reason is that when we design the machine to be intelligent, we smuggle in a definition there, because what it is for something to be intelligent is to do something of the sort that counts as intelligent for us. So an intelligent way of determining the temperature somewhere that involves reasoning or figuring out from cues what it might be is the kind of machine that we would count as an artificial intelligence machine. But if it turned out that there was a thermometer that can sense things at a distance, and it could do that job very well, we just wouldn't count that as an example of intelligence, even though it was the same function. So I think that classifying things as intelligent implicitly is to classify them by virtue of their similarity to how we do things. So I think there's a convergence, except for one qualification I would put on that. The people who are trying to build machines that are theories of human behavior want to add additional constraints to that, because they want the machine to do it subject to the sorts of constraints that we have, that is, subject to the fact that we have, subject to having short-term memories of the kind that we have, subject to other kinds of architectural constraints. For example, they need to work in the same wavelengths as our visual system and so on. People who are building general robots might not necessarily want to be constrained to those. But other than that, I think they're pretty much convergent tasks. Building a general intelligence and building a model of a human intelligence, I think, are pretty convergent.
I think we have time for just one, well, two more questions, but short. We have to be short because we have to be out of here by 10. I think one in the far back and one by the door here.
Is a ballet dancer intelligent? Is there knowledge in ballet dancing?
I think the word intelligence is much too loaded, and I shouldn't be using that. I should be using the term cognition, which means knowledge dependent. Now, with respect to ballet, it's an empirical question. It turns out that people who have investigated skills, motor skills, say typing and so on, have discovered that there's a larger component of cognition than people had admitted before. That is, it's not just a matter of tuning muscles, but in fact, it's a matter of sending out the right kinds of codes. It's a matter of processing the information in the right way. That's not the whole story, mind you, but it's part of the story. I'm sure that ballet is largely not a cognitive process, but I think that there is some cognitive processing that's involved in it.
Just a second ago, you mentioned the word consciousness. And is it possible for a computer to develop identity of consciousness?
There are people who speculate on that kind of question, and that question bothers me a great deal. The question is whether it's possible to have a machine that has consciousness. And the reason that I have difficulty with that is because the notion of consciousness is not yet in the category of a scientific puzzle. It's in the category of a mystery. And the distinction between the two is the following. If somebody had a perfect, elegant, empirically correct theory of consciousness, we couldn't recognize it because we don't know what the question is well enough. I mean, there really is a fundamental problem of understanding what the puzzle is, since you can imagine, to try to sharpen it, you can imagine two systems that behave identically. They answer the questions the same way. If you ask them, are you conscious? They say, yeah. One of them is conscious and the other isn't. How do you tell them apart? What is the magic thing that makes something conscious that's not itself behavioral or functional? And we think that there is. I mean, I believe that there is. I think that I could be unconscious and behave just exactly as I do now, because there is...
Did you have a... Yeah.
I also wanted to ask, is there a possibility for artificial
intelligence to duplicate intuition and also emotion, in a sense, to take that in consideration? Again, it's something which we don't understand, I imagine.
Yeah, that's the problem. I think that the situation with intuition is in slightly better shape, because intuition is used to refer to leaps of reasoning where we're not aware of any cogitation, any reasoning things through. And it turns out in experimental studies that almost all the reasoning that goes on, except for very deliberate things where you're sitting down and working out a problem, almost all reasoning that goes on is reasoning that one isn't consciously aware of. I mean, look at the examples that I showed of image understanding or assigning a referent to a pronoun. If that occurs in a normal context, you're not aware of any reasoning going on, but patently there had to have been some. So a lot of what's called intuition is just reasoning that you're not aware of, very rapid reasoning. With respect to emotions, I think it's one of those categories that may well end up, a large portion of it being a purely biochemical phenomena. That is, a phenomena whose explanation is going to be biochemical and not cognitive. But certainly aspects of it are cognitive, because if I touch something hot, I burn myself and I have a pain, that part, the having of the pain, is not a computational process. On the other hand, thinking, hey, that hurt and I shouldn't do it again, that is. So noticing that there was this qualitative pain and making inferences from it, that's cognitive. But the part that actually results in, say, an emotional state or results in depression or pain, I suspect that that's not going to receive a cognitive explanation, in other words, a computational explanation.